African American achievement has often been tied to the civil rights movement of the mid-1960s. However, during that era of racial divide, African Americans had long-standing multi-generational accomplishments in a parallel society where social class and ethnicity were not a barrier to achievement. For more than 70 years, Scurlock Studio in Washington, D.C. captured images of famous and not so famous Americans and events embedded into the American consciousness. They were the official photographers of the historically black Howard University, and 2 of the Scurlock photos became U.S. Heritage postage stamps. I'm Grace Baker. Today, in this special documentary program, we have one of the members of the Scurlock family, George Scurlock. He is the Small Local Business Enterprise Administrator for the MDC. He'll share firsthand stories about living and growing up among these achievers, as well as the legacy of Scurlock Studio and how these images impacted the work at MDC and our culture and future generations. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Hi, Grace. I'm delighted to be here with you today.
First, I want to tell us about Scurlock Studio, because this was obviously an entity that was able to capture so many images that we see now. All of us have seen at one point or the other.
Yes, and even though it's a capturing of famous photography, as we will talk about today, it really was just a family business. It was started in 1913 by my grandfather, Addison Scurlock. He first apprenticed with a white photographer in the Washington, D.C. area. My grandfather, Addison, was from North Carolina area, migrated to the Washington, D.C. Community, apprenticed with, as I said before, a white photographer, and then set out on his own in 1913 to be a portrait, commercial, large group, institutional photographer.
So let's talk about some of the images that he captured. Let's get right into that.
Okay.
Some of the names that come up that we're familiar with. We have some of the images here in studio.
Yes.
Who comes to mind? Obviously we have Duke Ellington. Tell us about some of the other ones.
Yes, we have as our centerpiece W.B. Du Bois. This is a striking photo, I think. There's a different one that's older, captured later in life, but I think this silhouette in sepia tone is the photography, the brown effect that is captured. It's called sepia tone in photography. The portrait, side silhouette portrait of him, I think, is magnificent. Certainly Benjamin O. Davis Jr., Madam C.J. Walker, who we'll talk about, Dr. Martin Luther King, when he came to talk at Howard, the famous event of Marian Anderson singing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1939 after she was denied the opportunity to sing at Constitution Hall in Washington, is another series that was captured. So we captured both formal studio portraits and walk of life type pictures, events, capturing events of the period.
Did most people know that these photos were captured by a black studio?
I think so. I mean, in terms of the audience that saw them, because we're talking about a period when our society is pretty well segregated. And so it was another element of black middle class life, which is captured by the studio's photographs. And so the same way that there were black photographers, there were black bankers, black newspapers, black doctors servicing, again, the segregated community. So if you couldn't go to a white doctor, where did you turn? You turned to an African American and black doctor. And so I think amongst the community that we served, the market that we served, it was well known that Scurlock was a photographer of African Americans.
Okay, so tell us about some of the stories, because I've seen some of the photos and our audience will certainly see some of the photos.
Sure. Let's start with General Benjamin O. Davis Jr. When he was a Tuskegee Airman. That photograph was taken by my uncle Robert. In fact, let me roll back the tape a little bit and say that the photographic family consisted of my grandfather Addison and his 2 sons, George, my father, George Sr., and Robert Scurlock. So the 3 Scurlocks together constitute the photographic family that produced the images that are part of the Scurlock Studio collection. My uncle Robert happened to be a Tuskegee Airman. And was trained at Tuskegee and was part of the troops. So many times I would say, well, I'm asked, well, how did your family know to capture these famous Americans? In many cases, it was capturing pictures of the time, and then later on you discover that they evolve into being famous people. Certainly in the case of General Davis, that was the case. He was training along with my uncle to be a Tuskegee Airman. My uncle, being a photographer, brought his camera to the training facility and took that picture as one of several others that I'm sure he has. But the one we keep looking back on is that one because of what happened to Davis Jr.
Yeah. What about another photo you told me about at Duke Ellington's house? I think
Yes.
There was a party.
Yes. Again, the family was born and raised, was housed, excuse me, I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. And we actually lived on 12th Street Northwest in Washington, 3 doors down from Duke Ellington's home. And Duke Ellington was famous at the time, but now in a modern context, people think, well, in terms of a suburban gated community thing, or you'd have a home in an exclusive neighborhood where there'd be guards or anything protecting you from protecting guests from having access to those homes. Well, you know, in a segregated society, you know, that wasn't available to you, so you just lived it was a row house along with everyone else, but a couple of stories associated with living there. The photograph you're talking about features Duke Ellington at the piano and a house party, family, friends. My father's taking the photo, so he's not in it, but my mom's in there. Billy Strayhorn is in the photograph, famous collaborator with Duke and co-writer. In some cases, it's said that Duke co-opted some of the rights that Billy Strayhorn actually wrote in terms of them. The other couple people in the photograph are Duke's wife, India, and Mercer Ellington, Duke's son, who was my dad's best friend, George Sr.'s best friend growing up. They used to set up a lemonade stand in the summertime and sell lemonade for 3 cents a cup together.
Did you appreciate the arena that you were in and the different people whose presence you were in at that time? And if not, how did that emerge for you?
Yeah, growing up I didn't as much. It was the family business of what Dad did. You know, Mom had her job. She would go off in the morning to Howard where she worked, and that was just Dad's business. But in terms of the environment I was surrounded with, it was in a professional, I'd say middle class, upper middle class African American community where there were people of achievement around me. For instance, my dad's high school class, the class of 1936 at Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C., in a segregated environment, it was a segregated high school at that time, included folks like Dr. Charles Drew, later developed plasma, and Senator Edward Brooke. So those were classmates. So there were really all these role models. In fact, the first hard leather pair of shoes I got as a baby, my first leather shoes as a baby, were given to me by Senator Edward Brooke's mom. So the community was very small at the time. There were people who went off and did larger things in life, later in life, but I was always surrounded by wonderful role models. I think of Samuel Westerfield, an ambassador in Africa and things. So I always saw my next door neighbor was Colonel Joel Adams, who was a bird colonel in the Army and stuff. So I always saw those sort of role models around me.
Well, let's talk about the environment at that time, because one thing that you like to say, talk about, is how the civil rights movement seems to be the pivotal point where everyone refers to in terms of achievement streamlining from there.
Yes.
Talk about the environment at that time where you were in the midst of all of that, but yet on the other side, this kind of parallel society that you'd like to speak of sometime.
Yes, I do think so. I think we talk about integration and the values of integration, the progress, historical progress, and it's anchored in the Civil Rights Act of '64. And I like to suggest that there's a long history before that, and that's what the Scurlock Studio captures to a large degree. There was a parallel society, again a segregated society, as I alluded to before, where people went out to do jobs, but they also had to access medical care, doctors, and would need legal assistance at different times. And you think about the historically black colleges and universities. They weren't established since 1964. They've been in place for over a century. So we've been educating black folks, and we've had professionals, but our history books seem to think that the whole history around us and black achievement starts with '64 and moves on. And I suggest there's always been a parallel society of success and achievement, and that's what the Scurlock Studio accomplishes. In terms of my own growing up, I wasn't really aware of much in the way of difference in segregation until around 10 or 12. The story most comes to mind is of trying to go to the local amusement park in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. technically is in the South. The Mason-Dixon line, going back to Civil War eras, was actually the line between Pennsylvania and Maryland. So Maryland South was considered part of Dixie, and Washington, being wedged between Maryland and Virginia, was really in the South. I would ask every spring when the local amusement park called Glen Echo would start its advertising in newspapers and on TV, let's go to Glen Echo Amusement Park. I'd say, Mom, can we go to Glen Echo? And my mom would say, not this year, not this year, when I was very young. I'd keep asking, Mom, can I go to Glen Echo this year? No, we can't go. And then when I was about 12, I think, is my recollection, when I asked her that issue, she said, George, we're not going to Glen Echo this year because we can't go to Glen Echo. We're Negroes and we're not allowed to go.
So how did that play with you, obviously being denied for something so simple, yet you were amongst all these, achieving African Americans?
Yeah, it was a
What was the
dichotomy in my
message
mind. Why couldn't folks be allowed to go to this public amusement park was what I wrestled with. And it's not like people were going to go and shoot the place up and be disruptive. These, in terms of the community that I was exposed to, successful both high school and college educated folks in professional careers, it just didn't make any sense to me. I mean, I think as a 12-year-old, I just processed it, okay. Instead of one of those nagging questions you have as a youngster, why is that the case? Why is that the case? But it clearly was something I couldn't do anything about. And so my recollection is I just moved on with it.
So let's talk about that for a minute, and the historical impact. What do these photos say to other young people coming? Because obviously, at one point or the other, we all seen a Jackie Robinson, we've seen Madam C.J. Walker. Students learn about it in school as part of history.
Yes.
So what do these images that we see, what is the message behind that for young people particularly?
I think the message is that there's a long-standing, you said it well in your intro to our segment today, there's long-standing history of black achievement that I think has been ignored by history books. And to the extent that it's captured in images like this and have the chance during this program and others to share that with other folks, I think there's a real value there. But I do think that the history speaks to black history in terms of the Civil Rights Act moving forward. Slavery, and then this big hole, and then the Civil Rights Act. Well, the Scurlock Studio photos capture some of that hole that's missing. There was successful achievement. You mentioned in the intro famous and not so famous. A lot of the images, there are 4,000 images that have been captured and are now archived at the Smithsonian
Talk
Institute.
about some of those not so famous.
Well, it's photos of families. It's military families coming back from the war. Studio portraits of folks. It's family portraits taken in people's homes. It's wedding photos. It's cotillion balls. It's large groups. It's Baptist churches doing mass baptismals in the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. There's a wide range of black life, both family life, military, professional, a large number of photographs of black businesses. Murray Brothers Printing Company, the U Street of Washington, D.C., where the Scurlock Studio was located, was a well-known black business district, like 125th Street in Harlem, very much a parallel sort of thing. And Scurlock, my uncle and father and grandfather, frequently took pictures of the businesses, the pharmacy business, Murray Brothers Printing, and just a wide range. So the fact that there was, even in a segregated world, a positive view, a positive achieving culture, it's something that I don't think is well known. That I think the assumption is that it took legislation to lift us up from the masses, but there's long been success in our culture, and that deserves recognition and deserves noting in our history books and deserves talking about like we're talking about today.
Let's talk about just a few more issues with regarding to the history books. What do you think is missing? You talk about that hole that was filled. What's missing from that?
An acknowledgement that there has been a parallel society. The people who write history books typically are white Caucasian and will write about what they know in the history that they've been able to trace. So I think I don't put it as a malicious thing necessarily. It's just a void, and I think there's an opportunity now. And part of my mission late in life in proselytizing about the Scurlock Studio whenever I can, to help fill that void a little bit, and hope that someone else will pick it up in terms of writing supplements to our history books or having our history books indeed going forward speak to this. I think all of and the passing of the Civil Rights Act of '64 isn't the be-all and end-all to our cultural success and achievement as a race. In fact, I think there's been some costs associated with it. I think
like what?
Like what? In integration terms, the one-liner I use is that all social progress comes at a social cost, and I think for the integration, for all the pluses it provided us, access to housing in communities we couldn't have access to before, ability to go to hotels we couldn't go before, public accommodations and things like that. What it also served to do was serve to, for logical reasons, serve as a migration of black role models from our black communities. When the black doctor who, when I grew up, there were big houses on the hill or larger than the rest of our houses, and those were typically occupied by the most successful of our race. Our black doctors, our black professors, black presidents of university, successful business people, successful lawyers, and those were the role models you looked up to. Ooh, I want to have a car like that. First Mercedes-Benz I saw when it was in my community, driven by a black doctor. You know, I'd like to have a car like that. I'd like to have a home like that. Well, what was the career that led to getting that? It was a professional career, which implied education. My concern,
Which you don't often hear about.
That you don't often hear about. And what happened when integration came into play, that doctor, as sometimes those communities began to erode and the value of the homes, you know, you make a practical decision in your life. Is my home, am I going to allow my big home's house value to decline over time, or will I move elsewhere? And when the opportunity became to move elsewhere, in many cases, many of the most affluent, most successful of folks from our communities left and moved on, leaving a void. And so what was filling that void, and where are the role models of achievement that are left in these more degraded, if you would, black communities, are the pimps, the hustlers, and the numbers runners. Those were the ones who had the big cars and the big houses at that point. And so it changed the role model, the community available role model, the easily seen role model in those communities migrated, I think, over time. So I think integration, in the absence of integration, we lived 3 doors down from Duke Ellington.
Right.
The black doctor was right there up the road. And so I think there's been some loss of that with integration. Now, the so-called regentrification of our cities, the co-opting of our black communities and white and black folks moving back into them, maybe in some way kind of turning that circle around a little bit. But I do think there was a cost, for all that we say positive about integration, I do think there was a cost in our black communities for that.
So tell us now, where is the collection and how the Smithsonian is involved?
Yes, the collection is now housed at the Smithsonian, specifically the Museum of American History within the Smithsonian. It's a wonderful caretaker. If you're going to have someone to take care of your collection, it might as well be the Smithsonian Institute. We're fortunate that the studio was based in Washington, D.C., so the local museum is, in fact, the national museum for the country.
And so they did an exhibit.
They did an exhibit. They hold all the business records, photos, business equipment of the Scurlock Studio as a permanent archive for researchers and for their own study. And they mounted a recent exhibit called Picturing the Promise, Scurlock Studio in Black, Washington. It was on exhibit in the National American History Museum from November of 2008 through February of 2010. It was actually extended 3 months because it was such a popular exhibit. There were 115 images from the exhibit on display and some of the equipment that was used at the time.
And it was the first time exhibit for them, correct?
The first time exhibit for the National Museum of African American History and Culture. They don't yet have a building for that museum, and so it was a cooperative display exhibit by both the American History Museum arm of the Smithsonian and the National Museum of African American History Culture arm of the museum. And a very prideful thing. The opening reception was wonderful. A lot of local dignitaries and politicians were there to help kick it off, and it was a very successful exhibit.
And then one other thing I want to know, talk about the heritage stamps, because of course the Smithsonian has the collection, and then stamps become in place from this collection as well. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, there have been 2 of those that have been mounted as Black Heritage stamps. The first was Madam C.J. Walker, the photo behind you. In fact, that's the very photo that was used for the stamp. I believe that was 1994, 95. And in 1996, as was on display here on the table between us, Dr. Ernest Just. He's less well known. Madam C.J. Walker is well known as the first black woman millionaire with a hair products business and things like that. Dr. Just was a biologist at Howard University, and he did some apparently groundbreaking work in membrane technology with regard to cells. So stuff beyond my technical capability, but he was a membrane, cell membrane specialist in biology, and he was one of the other subjects that the U.S. Postal Service chose to honor with a Black Heritage stamp. And one of my grandfather's photographs, Addison Scurlock's photographs, was used as the basis of the engraving that was later made of that stamp.
That's great. This is a good point to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk more about this significant impact that these images have on our culture, and more about Scurlock Studio.
There's been so many things that's held us down, but now it looks like things are finally coming around. No stopping, no stopping, no stopping, no stopping, no stopping, no stopping, no stopping.
And welcome back to our special documentary program sponsored by the Metropolitan District on Black Achievers and the photo images of Scurlock Studios. We have in the studio here a guest, George Scurlock, who is a member of the family. Let's talk about the photos and how the Scurlock family, Scurlock Studio, was commissioned to capture them.
Sure. As I said earlier, this was a family business, a business like any other, in competing in the marketplace. There certainly were other black photographers in the Washington marketplace. Robert McNeil is a name that comes to mind very readily. But late in the history of the studio, people of note, particularly African Americans who would come to Washington, would find their way to Scurlock Studio on purpose to have their picture taken. But there was also national competition, if you will, for this work. Many people know James Van Der Zee from Harlem. The Harlem Renaissance captured many of those photos, many of the jazz musicians and everything. There's a photographer named Polk out of Tuskegee who has national reputation and prominence in terms of African American history, and certainly Gordon Parks later in life, the Life
Absolutely,
magazine photographer and later filmmaker. But Scurlock, Van Der Zee, Polk, and Gordon Park are considered the four premier black photographers in African American history. So when that reputation began to be established, people would seek us out when they came to town. And certainly the connection to Howard University. I'm not exactly sure how the first connection, my family has both my father Robert and my dad George both graduated from Howard, so they were graduates, but I think the relationship was established with my grandfather Addison. And my guess, it was just like any other business, knocking on the door and saying, here's the quality of the work I do, would like to be your official photographers, and that was established. The relationship with Howard was long-standing and a wonderful one. In fact, the second largest collection of Scurlock images after the Smithsonian, having acquired the full set of Scurlock images, is located at Howard University and called the Morgan Spingarn Collection, housed in Founders Library at Howard. So there are people who actually go to that collection as well to do research and everything. So the connection to Howard is very strong. But I think it was just like any other business, competing for the business, winning the competition, doing good work, and then getting rewarded with additional assignments and additional projects.
Now, we talked about this a little bit earlier. You look at some of these photos, they're beautiful. A lot of it has lighting, there's soft hues going on. What made Scurlock Studio different from other photography houses?
Sure. There was a feel, it was called the Scurlock look around the photography, and you alluded to a lot of it, the soft images, the soft edges, the soft background. I think a lot of that was developed by my grandfather. He was a real craftsman of photography. He wasn't just a snapshot photographer. And think about the equipment that was available at the time. It was typically called what's called speed graphic, the old plate. You take a picture, almost like the old-fashioned photojournalist pictures with the big cameras that they would hold. They'd flash, the bulb would pop, you have to put a new bulb in to do it.
I've seen it in old movies.
Yeah, see, all those things you see in black and white movies. You take a picture, you have to slide the plate out and slide something back in. Those were the cameras that were mounted on tripods in the studio when you're doing studio work. But those were the things you lugged around when you did the more impromptu candid shots. But my grandfather was a craftsman at that work. He actually developed a technique that was copied by photographers all over using speed graphics in a large ballroom setting where you want to get focus. There's a famous picture of the NAACP ball in 1912 featuring a young W.B. Du Bois in the picture, everyone in black tie and tails and dressed to the nines and everything. It's a photograph taken from the balcony of the hotel ballroom where this was taken. And amazingly for the time, 1912, the people in the front are in focus in the picture, and the people in the back of the room are in focus in the picture.
All because of this technique?
All because of the technique. He learned the technique of tilting the camera in a certain way that you could get both the front and the back images to be in focus and not have the back be fuzzy and the front be sharp, or the other way around, focus on the back or focus on the middle and have both the front and the back be out of focus. So he was a true craftsman, and he developed this look in terms of the photography that he must have taught to my father and uncle, and became the style, the same way that Peter Max, the posters of the 60s and 70s had a style. When you see a poster or artwork done by an artist, you know it. People, without seeing the little Scurlock in the corner, were frequently looking at a picture and said, that looks like a Scurlock photograph.
So it was recognizable, because of this technique.
Yes.
So let's talk about the school.
Yes.
Because you have this technique, and the school, and you founded the school, or Scurlock Studios founded a school, correct?
Yes. Around World War II, toward the end of World War II, my father and uncle, Robert and George, founded Capitol School of Photography. The primary purpose was to train black service people coming back from the war in photography, to give them ability to get jobs with newspapers, magazines, and or to set up themselves as photography professionals, independent photography professionals themselves. One unique anecdote associated with the studio is, so again, the target audience was black GIs coming home to train them. We got a call, my uncle got a call from, turned out to be a white woman. She says, I'm a new reporter for the Washington Post. During the war now, we can't send out both a photographer and a reporter to do an assignment. They're requiring that reporters learn photography themselves because in the war effort, all the men were gone and it was a much more strapped labor market. I need to learn photography in order to get this job that I've just been promised at the Washington Post. Can I come to your school and learn photography and get certified to get the job? And they said, sure. Well, it turns out this young woman was Jacqueline Bouvier.
That's amazing.
And she got her certificate, she got her job, and one of her first assignments as a cub reporter was to interview the new young congressman from Brookline, Massachusetts, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And as they say, everyone knows the rest of the story.
Yeah.
So one could say, were it not for this Black School of Photography, Jackie and JFK would have never met one another, and Camelot never would have occurred.
That's amazing. I'm sure people don't know that story.
No, it's a wonderful history story, and we're very proud of to have that sort of influence in the future of American history.
How has this work, this experience with Skrillex Studio, growing up among all these stories, impacted your professional career?
Yes. Well, as a result of the exposure to what I saw growing up, the role models that I saw, the educated professionals, the